You don't know flag. You don't know flag.
Welcome to You Don't Know Flag, a podcast full of stories about retro gaming, retro computing, video games, arcade games, and technology from a guy who was there and still is. My name is Rob O'Hara, but for the next 30 minutes, you can call me Flag.
Episode 138. The Atari 2600.
Hello, and welcome to episode 138 of You Don't Know Flack. My name is Rob Flack O'Hara, and on today's show we will be talking about the Atari 2600. We have a lot to catch up on this episode, so we're going to go ahead. I've already pre-recorded the show. This is the dumbest stick in podcast history, by the way, that I store the podcast on the Commodore. But you know what? I started it, so we're going to run with it. So let's all pretend that I am loading the podcast off of my Commodore 64, and while it's loading, that'll give us a few minutes to chat during loading time.
Loading time. Loading time. Loading time.
Apparently, You Don't Know Flack has slipped into bi-weekly mode. No, that's not twice a week. That is every other week. I'm starting to see podcast slip go on here. For a couple reasons, actually. And actually, the biggest reason is that I've started doing throwback reviews. I'm going to blame them. I'm going to blame the guys at Throwback, Sean and Dor. I've also been doing some moonlighting on the Adventure Club podcast, and I'm still doing little bits for the Retroist. And so, especially on Throwback and the Adventure Club, what I have found is that I really enjoy that format. I enjoy, on both Throwback and Adventure Club, it's usually me and a couple other people, 2 people, usually sometimes 3 people on Adventure Club, kicking around and talking and being funny and reacting and having conversations. And that's a totally different kind of podcast than what I do here at You Don't Know Flack. You Don't Know Flack is basically just me talking into this mic with wind noise in the background. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I am now, I mentioned on episode 137, I am now officially a member of the Throwback Reviews group. So if you want to go back to Facebook or on Twitter and look up the Throwback Reviews podcast, we're on there. We're on Google+. So go like those things, join up into our little circles. We'll talk about Throwback Reviews. Traditionally was retro movie reviews, but we're kind of expanding. We did the episode about toys. Then last time we did an episode, a review of the skateboard movie Thrashin' from the 80s. That was a lot of fun. And the next episode will be a review of Goonies. Actually, if you go listen to Throwback Reviews near the end of I shouldn't tell you where it's at, but I will tell you near the end of the episode if you listen to that. There's instructions on how to enter a contest, and one lucky listener will win a copy of Goonies on DVD for the next episode. So I'm having a blast with the guys at Throwback Reviews. I just did another spot on Adventure Club podcast. We talked about Oklahoma film locations, and those guys, you never know where the conversation's going to go. Pretty soon we started talking about movie locations and ended up talking about owning pigs as pets and all kinds of crazy stuff. We talked a lot about the Christmas Story house, and we talked about several movies that were filmed in Oklahoma, including Weird Al's UHF. So, of course, I'll add links to all these, but Adventure Club podcast, no matter who's on that show, that's a great podcast, and they're actually expanding into an entire podcast network with a lot of great podcasts. So, and then the new episode of The Retroist is all about Galaga, a classic arcade game. Everybody loves Galaga, and I did my little talking tech segment for that. But even if I hadn't, I always highly recommend the Retroist podcast. And then I haven't contributed lately to the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast. And it's not because I haven't wanted to, it's because most of the games he's been talking about lately are ones I didn't own. So I just haven't had anything to contribute, but I still listen to the show. Ferg's show is great, the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast, so be sure to check out Ferg's show. If you listen to both Throwback Reviews and Adventure Club podcast, you'll find that I have been repeating some of the stories. I was just talking to Sean and Throwback about that, so I'm going to try not to do that. I have actually considered going back and listening to every episode of You Don't Know Flack and like building a database of every story I've told to make sure that I don't retell stories. That's a really bad habit of mine. And the problem is that I don't know I'm doing it. You listen to the podcast and you'll hear me telling the story, so I won't know that I'll do it, but so I may go back and do that. If you listen carefully in the background, you can hear the fans on my server. Something has gone crazy with my server lately. The fans just decided that they want to be super loud. And it's summertime, so it's getting hotter, so maybe they're cranking up to blow out some of that hot air. I don't know what's going on, but I've posted on a few forums and on Facebook, and I've been gathering information about getting a quieter server case, so I see that in my immediate future. I jokingly told both the guys at Throwback and Adventure Club that I'm tired of being the loudest person on all those podcasts, you know. So anyway, I'm looking into that, looking into maybe putting in some noise reduction solutions here in the old quote-unquote recording booth, which the recording booth is a little tiny computer room in here with it's full of crap. What else has been going on? Let's see, I mentioned on the last episode that I had just acquired the Rancor Keeper, and over the weekend, Vintage Stock had another sale, and I went and checked, and I ended up getting 3 more Star Wars figures. Actually, I got 2 that I needed. I got Greedo, which is one that I had as a kid, and I just don't know what happened to him. He, hand must have shot him or something. I don't know what happened to Greedo. But I've reacquired Greedo, and I also got the B-Wing pilot, which is one of those figures that you just, if you're trying to collect them all, you got to buy it. I don't have a B-Wing. The B-Wing pilot, I mean, when your name is B-Wing pilot, his name's not Ralph or anything like that, it's just guy that flew this ship, and so, he's one of those on there. And then I also got a Bespin Leia, which I had, but I found one that had the original vinyl cape, so I went ahead and picked that up. I also picked up an Imperial Troop Transport, which was complete in the box. And actually, mine, it doesn't say Imperial Troop Transport, it says something else. But if you remember, you wouldn't know this really from the movie, but this is, it came out during Star Wars. It's a toy. It rolls around like a car. It's like a little spaceship that looks like it's supposed to be hovering, maybe. And there are little pods on the side where people stand up so you can transport around Imperial troops. And then there are 2 doors in the front that are, what do they call it? Like suicide doors. They open open from the front back. And the Star Wars version of the toy that came out had 6 buttons on the top, and you put batteries in there, and you would press these buttons, and it would play sounds. In the Empire Strikes Back version of the toy, which is the one I just got boxed, they removed all those electronics. So the inside of the toy is pretty much hollow, and there's no electronics. There's the battery case is still there, but there's, the little plastic is hollowed out, but there's no electronics for the battery. But anyway, paid too much for that, but can mark that off the list. And then my wife was like, I thought you have one of these. I'm like, well, I do, but not in the box. Which then begs the question, did I just pay $100 for a cardboard box? And the answer is no, because it was a third off. So really, I paid $66 plus tax for a cardboard box. So, Imperial Troop Transport, I can mark that off the list. What else has been going on? Oh, I just got a review of Commodore. I'm going to get on the computer. I've also been told that when I type, it's really loud. A fellow named Joe Barlow who's on my Facebook, and he has a website called Sword of Pixels, and I'll link to that, swordofpixels.com. But can't relate to this guy at all. The top of his website says retro games, text adventures, joystick wiggling, being eaten by grooves, all the stuff that made your childhood great. Oh wait, I can relate to every part of that. But anyway, Joe just wrote, just today, July 15th, wrote a review about Commodore, and it's very nice, and it says what some of the other reviews that I've read said, which is that he could relate to all the stories. And it's funny that I never realized when I was writing Commodore how universal that those stories would be. You know, I mean, like I have memories. One of the things he mentions is working with print shop and newsroom, because I mentioned that in Commodore, and he talked about how he did that. And the one thing I love about his review is it refers to me as Mr. O'Hara like 900 times, which the only people that have ever called me Mr. O'Hara would be my principal, and probably my grandmother right before she would hit me with the stick she used to have. Yeah, you know, he basically says that the stories that I told, that he could relate to every one of them, that it was very universal, and that was kind of, I didn't realize that when I wrote it. I didn't realize how many people, and not only, people have told me that in reviews, but people from other countries, a lot of people have read Commodore and mentioned, you know, that how much they could relate to those stories. So anyway, I appreciate the review. He mentions here at the end that you could get both the paperback version and the Kindle version from Amazon, which is true. However, if you would prefer, you could go to robohara.com/Commodore, and you can order the paperback version. A lot of people prefer that because if you order it directly from me, I can sign it, which personally I think would do nothing but lower the value of the book. I can't imagine that making it worth anymore, but I'm always glad to sign books if you order the paperback from me, or the PDF is also available through the website, and it's PayPal. You pay PayPal and it sends you to a link where you can download it, and the PDF is completely DRM free, so you can put it on whatever device you want. You can put it on iPads or Android tablets or on your Chromebook or whatever it is that you want to read it on. So I think a lot of people, you know, and I know, I understand the irony of putting a book out in DRM-free version and the entire book. I mean, not the point, but a strong subject matter of the book is how we used to pirate software, you know, back in the Commodore days. So, you know, I get it, and I know I'm asking for it, and I have seen copies of it floating around on torrents, and, you know, at some point it's, you know, what can you do? The people that'll pay for it will pay for it, and the people that don't are the people that, you know, is how I was when I was a kid, so. Anywho, so thanks again, Joe, for that review. I really appreciate it. And with that, let's see. I know, God, I'm so bad right now. I'm so far behind on email. Oh gosh, you know what? This isn't even something I was going to talk about, but I've got this email and it's burning me up right now. That I got an email from these people that are trying to sell me FLAC.org. So, if anybody wants to put together some sort of indie funding thing or a Kickstarter or whatever, they want $5,000 for FLAC.org, which just pisses me off. I went and looked up the traffic. I've looked. I mean, this domain has been parked for the last 12 years. Nobody's using it. There's no way it's worth $5,000. In fact, this is stupid that I'm reading this. Let me find this email that I sent, just so I could quote myself. The last thing I wrote back to them is, the real reason I want it is because my license plate says FLAC, and I would like an email address to match it, but for $2,500... Oh, by the way, he said they might come down to half. I said, for $2,500, I'll buy a used Honda and stick with Rob O'Hara at robohara.com. So, I just hate domain squatters. It's like they're not using it. They should just give it to me. Wouldn't that be great if that's how the world works? When you're like, you know what, you're done with that? Just give that to me. So anyway, it does not look like I will own FLAC.org anytime soon, but who knows? Somewhere out there, there's somebody who has read my book and loved it and and put together a Kickstarter, and let's get that domain going. I don't want the domain, not for that kind of money. Oh, look at that! Good timing. Podcast has finished loading on the Commodore. We will continue that shtick until I get sick of it. So, podcast has loaded, and let's move on with episode 138, the Atari 2600. Those of you who listened to episode 1 of You Don't Know Flack, or whatever it is, 101, 100, the first episode, I talked about firsts. And those of you that have listened to that episode know that the Atari 2600 was not the first console we owned. We actually owned a Magnavox Odyssey 2. And the Odyssey 2, the original Odyssey, if people say, I always just called it an Odyssey. But an Odyssey technically was the older systems, which were basically Pong clones. I don't want to say clones, but they basically played Pong. But the Odyssey 2 was the game system that was similar to the Atari. Now, it was did not have the graphics that the Atari had. I don't think it had, maybe it on a technical level, it may not have been quite as good as the 2600. Some of that is probably a matter of opinion. But it did have a built-in keyboard. And so my dad, I suspect, was behind the decision of picking the Odyssey 2 over the Atari 2600. And, later, as I've talked about, he would go ahead and buy the TRS-80 Model 3 computer. The Odyssey 2, so we had an Odyssey 2. Everybody that we knew were getting Ataris. So none of my friends at school had Odysseys. Nobody in the neighborhood had Odysseys. We had an Odyssey. Everybody else had an Atari 2600. And the only place that we could get games locally for the Odyssey 2 was Service Merchandise. And the Service Merchandise was probably maybe 10 miles away from our house. And one of the things that my dad has told me was that it was very difficult to find games for the Odyssey 2 locally. They were either out of stock or, not many places had them. And so that basically is why we ended up getting rid of the Odyssey 2 and getting an Atari 2600. And so that's what we did. We got the Atari 2600, and I'm trying to remember. I know we had Combat. I know we didn't have very many games in the beginning. I know that we had Outlaw, and I know that we had Breakout. I remember those games specifically. And then after a couple of years after the Atari had been released, we went to Chicago. We went on vacation to Chicago, and we stayed with, I always called them my aunt and uncle, Pam and Jerry. So we stayed with Pam and Jerry, and they had an Atari. And they had several games that we didn't have. They had Skydiver. I remember playing Skydiver quite a bit up there. They had Air Sea Battle. I remember playing that. And they had Superman. And if you've never played Superman, I a lot of these games I can't wait, because I have a lot of stories about these games. And I don't want to play all my cards because I'm saving some of them for Ferg's podcast, for the Atari 2600 Game by Game podcast. But I'll tell you, the goal of the game Superman was to fly around and put this bridge back together, take all the Lex Luthor's henchmen, put them in jail, go change back into Clark Kent. I mean, it was a game that could take, it was difficult because all the pieces in the game were random, and depending on how you set the difficulty switches, would be how far some of the things would be scattered, or different ways to affect the gameplay. But the point of it is that in Superman, I mean, you could have games that would take like 5-10 minutes, whatever. And I happened to have a really lucky run while the adults were up there watching, and I beat Superman, and it was just a phenomenal time. It was like 30 to 40 seconds. I think it was like 32 seconds or something. I mean, it was really unbelievable. And it made them so mad. They spent the whole rest of the week trying to. I mean, I couldn't beat that time now. I probably never beat it again, but it was just one of those luck of the draw type situations where everything just came into place. But I do remember playing Superman up there. I don't know that I need to go into the hardware aspects of the Atari 2600. I think anybody listening to this podcast probably had an Atari or was at least familiar with Atari. They started off with the heavy sixers, which they were called. Then they moved to the regular 6-switch. I'm just kind of going through this mentally. There's the 4-switch Woody, which still has the wood grain console, and then the 4-switch Vader, which is all black. Followed by, you have the 2600 Junior models. I mean, I don't want to get too much into variations and stuff, because there's a ton of variations when you get into the Sears models, the Telegames, and things like that. But there's several different models of Atari. I think I probably still have one of all of those at least. I know I have a heavy sixer out in the garage, a light sixer. I know I have all the 4s and everything. So I still do have a bunch of Ataris. One thing I remember about the Atari was arcade games, being able to play them at home. Pong was technically an arcade game, but maybe it's because I was so young. I didn't associate Pong with being an arcade game. Pong was just something that you played. You had a Pong machine and you're hooked up to your TV or whatever when I was a kid, and then you got an Atari and it played more games than Pong. But things like Breakout and Combat, which was basically a port of Tank, were games that you could see in an arcade. But a lot of those arcade games of that era weren't. I hadn't seen those. But the one that I remember being a huge deal was Space Invaders. And when Space Invaders came out, I mean, Space Invaders was like, I can't even explain it. I mean, they were like, you've heard the stories about there being coin shortages or yen shortages, and I mean, Space Invaders was just like this giant deal. And then they were going to release Space Invaders on the Atari 2600. And this is true. My dad let me skip school. He let me stay home sick the day Space Invaders came out. That's how big it was. And we went down to Toys R Us, and we bought Space Invaders, and we came home, plugged it into the Atari, and it was bowling. Now, to this day, I really don't know how that happened. I mean, if you think about Atari games being assembled on an assembly line, it's not like you could just accidentally make one bowling, And it was the first day, so it wasn't like somebody had bought it, switched out, the little card, and then returned it to Toys R Us or something. I don't think there was enough time for that to happen. And, I mean, as far as I can remember, the game was sealed when we bought it. The only thing I could ever think was that maybe somebody at the plant had swapped the wrong one, into, but I definitely remember that. Coming home and finding bowling instead of Space Invaders. So we had to drive back to Toys R Us, change it out, and get Space Invaders. But we did, and I just played the crap out of Space Invaders. I mean, if you look at it now, what a basic game. I mean, you move left and right, you shoot, aliens that are moving left to right and slowly moving down. Just an incredibly simple type game, but boy, we spent a lot of time playing it. I'm pretty sure we had Space Invaders before we had Asteroids, but I remember eventually having Asteroids, and Asteroids was one I would play. It just seems like forever, You just play Asteroids just all day until you got tired of that, and then you go back to Space Invaders. Space games, I guess, in general, were big back then. I've read that, as far as arcades went, that space games were very popular because it was very easy to program things with a black background. And so that was, you combine that with the popularity of Star Trek and Star Wars at that time, and it made sense to churn out space-related games. It's funny that I mentioned Star Wars because, as most people know, the first Star Wars game, well, there was Star Wars in the arcade, but the first Star Wars game that came out for the Atari was Empire Strikes Back. And Empire Strikes Back was Different looking. I mean, you flew your snowspeeder around and you attacked AT-ATs, and it was one of those type of games that you couldn't actually win. I mean, it just got faster and faster and faster until you eventually got killed. Actually, and I guess if you defeat all the AT-ATs, then just another wave comes in or whatever. But the Christmas that I got that game, my sister got, I don't think it was Frogger. I think it was Strawberry Shortcake. Strawberry Shortcake is one of the most annoying Atari games, where all it is basically you have the main, I think there's 5 or 6 Strawberry Shortcake figures, and there's a head, torso, and legs, and it mixes them up, and then you have to put the right head, torso, and legs together, and when you do it, it plays a little song, and they dance, and then you move, on to the next one. It's so annoying, and so my sister would take turns. I would play Empire Strikes Back for an hour, or maybe half an hour, and then she would play Strawberry Shortcake, and we would alternate back and forth until one of us cracked. But I remember playing Empire Strikes Back a lot. I remember playing Pitfall. Pitfall was an amazing game. I had never seen a game with that many rooms with that much of a scope, and you would run around and, of course, collect the treasure, and we would draw little maps, so we would know where we were going and things like that. Pitfall is one of those games that has been out now for over 30 years, and I've never beat it. I've never got all the treasures within the allotted amount of time. And like a lot of games, I don't know that I ever knew that there was an end goal. I mean, I knew that you were supposed to collect the treasure and try to get a high score, but I didn't know that there was a, end game that we were shooting for. I was just, running through the jungles, and I've plugged Racing the Beam before, the book. If you haven't picked up Racing the Beam, and it's available online as an ebook or as a physical copy, but either way that you get it, I highly recommend that. Even if you're not a huge Atari fan, just to understand the scope of what they were working with. The story about Pitfall, one of the things is it's 4K. It's probably like the equivalent of less than a second of whatever the recording, of this podcast is. And there's a part in there where he talks about, I think it was, it's either wanting to show the clock or wanting to show how many remaining men you have, but he had to go move things around in memory to make enough room for it to do that. Where now, we used to joke. Remember when we joked when Windows came on a set of floppies? You could get the 3 floppy version. Well, there was a 3 disc version of DOS, and then there was Windows, and then there was the 6 disc version of Windows, and then eventually it was on a CD, and then it was megs, and now it's gigs. It's amazing just how big just an operating system has gotten. So 4K for Pitfall is just crazy, the amount of coding elegance that went into cramming that much of a game into that small of a area of memory. It's fascinating to me. So Pitfall was definitely a big one. Another big one was River Raid. Activision at that time, it seemed like they had the more colorful games, the more better sound and graphics. I got pretty good at River Raid. I could get really far. And I remember one time we went to the mall, and they were having a contest of, it was a River Raid contest, and it was on a giant projection television. And you went and signed up, and you paid, your money. I'm sure it was a couple of bucks or something. And I remember that the high score was like 16,000. And I thought, I could beat that. I beat that all the time. And so my parents paid, and they gave me a joystick, and I went, and I did really good on the first man. I got like 12,000 or something like that. And then when I died, it switched to player 2, and they were like, "Oh, you didn't make it." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And so it was, you only got one man that was was the contest. So I was really mad, because I probably could get 16,000 on one man on a good day for sure, but it didn't happen that day, so a little bummer. Now, right around the time we got River Raid, I remember we got 2 things in our house. One was we got wireless joysticks. And if you remember the wireless Atari joysticks, the top of them looked like Atari joysticks, but they were really deep. I mean, they're like 2 foot tall. Not quite 2 foot tall, but they were really big. And they had these giant, like the old school metal antennas that you would retract, and extend out of the front. I remember they were so big that as a kid I couldn't hold it with my hand. Like I would sit on the couch with the joystick, like, in between my legs and play it that way because my hand wasn't big enough to wrap around the entire base of the stick. The other thing that we got around that same time was a rear projection big screen TV, and I remember Firefox, I think, had just come out. Was that the Clint Eastwood movie? And there was like planes racing through canyons and stuff like that. And I remember playing River Raid on that big screen TV with those wireless sticks and thinking, this is exactly the same. This is the same as being in a movie, is these wireless joysticks. So now when you look at it, it is not the same as being in a movie. It's very, very much not the same. But so yeah, I definitely love River Raid. I definitely love. You know what I wasn't good at was adventure. And I did talk about this a little bit on Ferg's podcast, but I had got a copy of Adventure from my uncle, but I didn't get the instruction manual. So I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. I was just wandering around, picking up the bridge, picking up things, running from these giant ducks. I didn't know, I was so thrilled when I figured out that I could get a darn key and open a door and go in a castle. I mean, that was like the most exciting thing I ever did at that game. I didn't know it could be beat. Really, I just thought it was like an interactive demo. Like, oh, here's a game where you can pick stuff up and drop it. Well, that's exciting. Until eventually, this duck eats me. I mean, that's what I really thought that game was about. I had no idea until later. And I mentioned the same thing on Ferg's podcast, but I've heard about the Easter egg where you have to go use a magnet and you pull this dot that's invisible and then you take it to another room and you set it down and you do something and you get this guy's initials. First of all, that boggles my mind that anybody would ever figure out that kind of stuff on their own. I feel like, somebody told somebody originally and that person told somebody and then the word must have just got around. I just can't imagine people finding that on their own without ever knowing that there's a quote-unquote Easter egg in that game. So maybe they did, but I think people are fibbers. Let's see, what other games did I love? Yeah, I remember I had a cousin who had that was the cool thing about the Atari was that as time went on, there were so many different games that you went to someone's house and they would have different games than what you had. Like I remember going over to my cousins and they had 3 games that I remember. I remember they had tennis. I remember they had Defender. And I remember... Maybe I don't remember all 3. Seems like I was thinking of another one. But anyway. But tennis, I remember, was a big deal. And again, the simplicity of the games that we have now, on tennis, all you have to do is run where the ball is, and the guy automatically hits it. You don't even have to hit the button to hit the ball in tennis. You just have to be standing on the right spot. So we played a lot of tennis, and they had Defender, which I had played a little bit in the arcade, but it was, as a kid, it was too hard. It had too many buttons, and so I first saw Defender at their house, and then eventually got Defender. And that game always made more sense to me using a joystick to control it. I just never could get the button control system down of Defender, but with the joystick it was a lot of fun. And then there was Chopper Command, which was basically Defender except for with helicopters and things like that. But it was a fun game as well. My dad used to play Breakout a lot. I remember that. But I also remember that we got chess. And my dad was really good at playing chess. And he still is, I'm sure. But there were several difficulty settings. And on the hardest difficulty setting, it could take something like up to 24 hours to make a move. Because basically what it was doing was playing through the game so many moves in advance and trying to figure out, what the best possible move was. But it had to do all that in RAM. It didn't have the ability to store that in ROM just because the cartridge space wasn't big enough. So chess would run through all these iterations of possible game outcomes. And so I remember my dad having the television and the Atari tied up for days playing single games of chess. I know there were some other games that were like that. I think maybe the 3D tic-tac-toe might have been like that, and I think backgammon might have been like that. But chess, for sure, I totally remember. Another one that he played a lot, and that we all played a lot, was the Atari video pinball. And we actually, one of my good friends, Andy, his dad broke more than one Atari joystick. My wife says that her dad did the same thing, trying to play video pinball, trying to nudge that ball just a little bit too far to the left and snapping those sticks. Atari joysticks were pretty resilient. I mean, you could still find Atari joysticks today that have not been repaired. They're still working 30, 35 years later. So, and that's a testament to how they were built. And for that matter, Atari hardware in general. I mean, I've gone to flea markets and found games that look like they were stored in the dirt. I mean, they have crap caked on them, and you come home and blow them out, wash them out, and they work just fine. Same thing with the Atari consoles. Just a little bit of canned air, a little bit wet wash rag, and they're as good as new. So definitely did not. They say they don't build them like they used to, but if you look at some current consoles, look at the Xbox and the 360 with their red ring of death, or and that's not to pick on them. PlayStation, Sony, they had their issues. PlayStation 2 had issues. The PlayStation 1, if you had one long enough and you were desperate enough to turn your console upside down to try to get it to play full motion video without skipping, then you remember, what that was like. So yeah, Microsoft didn't corner the market on faulty hardware, and you could go back to flashing Nintendos and the pin adapters and stuff like that. But the Atari 2600, I mean, there's so few things that could go wrong with it. I suppose there are things that someone would repair, but I've never actually done it. I think every Atari that I've ever picked up, I've plugged in it and it still works. So. So I'm breaking the fourth wall here just a little bit. I mean, I don't know if there's a fourth wall. It's you guys and me, right? But I recorded the first half of this podcast a few days ago, and I didn't really write any notes before I started. I was like, I'll just get on and I'll record. I'll talk about the Atari. And so I kind of ran out of things to say, and over the last couple of days as I was editing the episode, I thought of so many more little stories that I wanted to share. So anyway, this is the second half of the podcast, so it's not a smooth transition. I thought I could splice it in there, but anyway, it might, how it is when you come back in, you're not sitting exactly the same place you were in front of the microphone, or it's still hot here in Oklahoma. I mean, it's late in the evening, so it's cooling off, but it's been close to 100 all day, so I have fans on, so it may sound a little bit different, but so that's what's going on. This is part 2 of the Atari 2600 episode of You Don't Know Flat. So I jotted down several different notes here, so these may be shorter type stories. I don't know that they'll segue together very well, but just some different things. One memory that I had of the Atari 2600 was playing with grown-ups. Now, of course, all of my friends had Ataris, and even, when friends would come over, you would play Atari, and when you went to their house, you would play Atari. But you didn't always have, your friends over, and there were... It's hard... I guess it's because the Atari was so new at the time that parents would play as well. I don't think that happens a lot as much today. I mean, I don't... hear of a lot of my friends that play, PlayStation or Xbox or whatever with their kids all the time. But back then, maybe because it was so new, that happened more often. But I do remember playing Combat quite a bit with my parents. I do remember my dad and I comparing Pitfall scores. I talked about playing Pitfall. One kind of funny memory is I remember when my grandma Flack, not really, Grandma O'Hara, came down to Oklahoma to come visit us. And it was when the Atari was relatively new, and we sat on the floor in front of the TV and played bowling. And I think it's because when you're a kid, you recognize patterns a lot more quickly, but I could get a strike almost every time. And I remember on bowling doing it mostly by the sound. Like you would line your guy up wherever you would, with the pins, and then the bowling ball would make that woo, 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 woo sound, and I don't remember anymore, but it was like 6 or 7 or something, and then right at the end you would flick the joystick up to put the spin on the ball, and it would go up, and I would get a strike, almost every time. And I remember playing with my grandma, and she was, she did as good as any adult who that was their first time of playing. And I remember her saying that she had bad vision in one eye. And so she kept blaming it on that. She said, well, I don't see good out of this eye. Got really upset. Which is kind of funny now that I think about it, because it's not 3D. There's not like it was a depth perception problem or whatever. It was just, I don't think adults necessarily liked getting beat in anything, video games or anything else, by kids. But I do remember that. I do remember playing. We went over to a neighbor's house one time. I mentioned this in that first episode where the neighbor we went over to that had the TRS-80 Model 1, which is what inspired my dad to get the Model 3. And they had Dragster. Oh, no, it couldn't have been that early. But it was over there. It wasn't that same night. But I do remember seeing Dragster over there. And Dragster is a pain. It's a very difficult game. I know Ferg talked about it on his 2600 podcast. I'm terrible at it, and it's all about timing and shifting and not blowing your engine and doing all these things. And you have to do things, very quickly and in the right order. And I remember going over there and watching my dad and this neighbor and me, all trying to do it and beat each other. So there were a lot of things. I think playing on the Atari was a even, level playing field, literally, between kids and adults. It was whoever was better at the game. And I think there were, if it was a game where you had to think ahead, something like, maybe Dodge 'em or something, where if you could figure out where your opponent was going to go next, then you would have the advantage, and maybe adults would have advantage in that situation. And then there were games that just had, were reflex based, and maybe kids did have an advantage with that. Or if they learned, as kids played the games more, they learned, tricks or whatever, strategies with the game. So in those types of conditions, the kids would have the advantage. So another story that I remember about the Atari 2600 has to do with Keystone Kapers. And this story actually involves my other grandma, Granny Kraken, we used to call her. And Granny Kraken was, by all accounts, dirt poor. I'm trying to think. I mean, she lived in a part of town that was, an older town. She had a house. She lived with. She had got divorced, and so she had got remarried. And her and my grandpa lived in a house that was, I would say, less than 1,000 square foot. I mean, a tiny house. It was actually a 1-bedroom house, and then they had built on another section that became the second bedroom. But so they added it on, to make a 2-bedroom house. They lived in this 1-bedroom house, and as far as I can remember, I don't remember them really working. I know my grandpa, I think, was a janitor at a church, and I think she volunteered at a church. And one year for Christmas, she had asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I told her I wanted Keystone Kapers. I'd seen the commercials, and it just looked fantastic. I mean, really good graphics. It looked really fun, you know. And she was like, well, honey, I can't afford that, you know. And from my grandma, I used to get, just put this in perspective, I used to get like homemade mittens and homemade, you know, I mean, or stuff maybe from the dollar store. I don't know if they didn't have like Dollar Tree and stuff like we have now, but just, you know, trinkets, maybe a Hot Wheel car or something like that. I know that a lot of her spending money came from collecting and recycling aluminum cans. Her and my grandpa would go out and collect cans all the time. Sometimes when I would spend the night over there, she would have us, we'd go out in the driveway and we would, you know, stomp on all the cans and smash them down and put them in sacks for her. So, not people of means. And she said, you know, she was honest with me. I mean, I was a little kid, and she said that there was no way she could afford Keystone Kapers. And then I said, well, then I really didn't want anything. And I'm sure, like looking back with adult eyes, I'm sure that really hurt her feelings. It's one of my real regrets in life, was that. And anyway, when Christmas came around, she did get me Keystone Kapers. I have no idea. I'm guessing $35-$40 for a going Atari game back then, and that could have been her I don't even know. That could have been her month's budget for food or something. I'm sure she thought I was a little spoiled ass kid, you know. And I don't even know where they came up with that money, to be honest. Maybe my parents bought it and gave it to her to give to me or something like that. And, when my grandma passed away, my wife and I were both working where we work now, working for the government and making really good money. I mean, we're not well off or anything like that, but we don't have to worry about money from on a month-to-month basis. And I would, if I could do something for her now, if she were still alive, I mean, I could go over and just pay for her house. I mean, I'm sure whatever she owed on her house was what I have in the bank now, or pay off her car or do anything like that. And it's funny because when she passed away, there was some minor squabbling, and like I said, this was years later, like 2001, maybe 2002. I remember people squabbling over like who was going to get what, and this was a lady that owned, essentially nothing. She drove a Ford Escort that had gotten an accident, so she wasn't allowed to drive anymore. They had a camper that fit on the back of your truck. That was like their prized possession. A camper that would sleep two people or whatever. And so I mean, there was nothing that they had that I wanted or needed, and one of the few things that I have from her is a quilt that she made for me when I was a kid. And I always think like I could have had one more thing from her, but instead, I told her I didn't want that I wanted Keystone Kapers. So I'm sure I do still have that same cartridge, but it's not like something that somebody made for you, you know. But anyway, so Keystone Kapers, that game specifically, is always a little bittersweet. I mean, I don't like every time I see somebody playing it or whatever, I'm not like, oh, my grandma. No, it's not like that, but I don't know. That's just one of those things that you think about when you get older, you know, and you just think, well, you were a kid, you didn't know, you know, but when you're a grown up, you know. Anyway, all right, well, I brought that down. Let's move on to something else. Pac-Man. I wrote down Pac-Man here because everybody had Pac-Man. I had Pac-Man. I mean, Pac-Man, we all know the stories of, you know, the millions of Pac-Man cartridges that were made. They made more Pac-Man cartridges than there were Ataris because they thought it would sell consoles. There would be so many people lined up wanting to play Pac-Man that they would actually buy Ataris to do so. And people talk about the video game crash. I did the episode, I have a You Don't Know Flag episode about the video game crash. And people blame it on Pac-Man. And, you know, that is one contribution to the video game crash. That was one, not that game specifically, but, you know, people point to something specifically. It reminds me of, you know, in Oklahoma City here, we have the Oklahoma City Thunder. And there have been many games that we've gone to that we lose by one basket, you know. And so the very last basket of the game, maybe a guy shoots, you know, Kevin Durant goes up for the final shot. He misses the final shot. And, you know, he misses it, and so we lose, and then people go, oh, well, he lost the game. Well, really, there's 3 hours, or 48 minutes of game time or whatever, but of different things that could have gone either way. You know, maybe if somebody else had played defense better, or if Russell Westbrook had made a shot, or whoever. So it's hard to just pinpoint it on just that last person, and I think that's kind of what happened in Pac-Man's case. I know that it does take a lot of the blame for the crash, but as a kid, we thought it was okay. I played that game all the time, and my friends played that game all the time, and we knew it. It didn't look like the arcade version, but I don't remember. You know, I was probably in second grade, something like that, third grade when that came out. So I don't remember sitting around thinking, well, this is terrible, I won't play it. I mean, it was Pac-Man, and we all knew that the arcade machines were more powerful than what the Atari could do, so we didn't expect it to be, you know, an exact replica of what was going on in the arcade. We just thought that was the Atari version, and that's what we played. So I do think that it gets an unfair amount of grief in regards to the video game crash. I don't think it helped the industry, but I don't think that game single-handedly brought down Atari. And along those same lines with Pac-Man was E.T. Now, I will say that E.T. Is a pretty crummy game, and everybody knows that E.T. is a fairly crummy game, and I think there's one what's a good way to put it? Criteria, I guess, for making a good game. And we've said it before. I've said it on this podcast. Everybody says it. It should be a game that's easy to play and hard to master. And if you look at a game like just Tetris, it's the first game that just came to my head. Probably because it's associated with that saying. But Tetris, you can explain to a 4-year-old how to play Tetris. I mean, a 4-year-old gets it. You got to line the bricks up, and when they line up all the way across, a road disappears. That's it. And the button rotates the pieces one way or the other way, and the joystick moves. You know, it's not... You can explain to somebody how to play Tetris in 5 to 10 seconds. And more importantly, somebody looking at Tetris can figure out how to play Tetris. You know, when you go into an arcade, you don't want to have to read a manual. Nowadays, gosh, you know, if you look at a PlayStation or an Xbox game, And they kind of did away with manuals, didn't they? They went to tutorials, you know. So now whenever you buy a game, you got to spend 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever, going through these levels where pop-up after pop-up. I'm a fan of Need for Speed racing series. And, you know, every one, whenever you start off, you have to go through this stupid tutorial, and it tells you how to drive and how to steer and how to brake and how to, you know, drift and how to do all these different things where, you know, we didn't have tutorials back in the Atari 2600 days. You just picked up a game and you played. And arcade games were like that too. You might have a little bit of text on the screen explaining something or something written on the bezel, but for the most part, those games were supposed to be, you know, get up and go. And E.T. was not like that. That wasn't the first game that was like that. I talked about Adventure being maybe not completely clear of what the goals were if you picked it up and you didn't read the instruction manual, but E.T. specifically, the first time I saw E.T. was at Skaggs Alpha Beta grocery store, and they had an Atari kiosk there in their little electronics section, and they still have those. I've seen recently at Target, I saw they have a Wii and they have a DS kiosk or whatever, but you would go up and you would play games, and sometimes they would have, like, the one that was there had a lot of different games, and you would press which game you wanted to play. And some of them, I think, had, like, timers or something where you could only play one for so long, but I remember going to Skaggs, and my mom would let us, this was in the days where parents didn't care about their kids getting abducted, and so my mom would just let us go wander off, and you know, we would go to the electronics section and play Combat or play whatever. And I remember playing AT and just not being able to grasp what was going on. I just didn't, you know, without the manual, without, you know, we'd seen the movie. I knew there was an alien. I knew there was probably some Reese's Pieces, maybe kids on bike riding in front of the moon, and guys holding guns / walkie-talkies, depending on which version of ET you're a fan of. But, you know, without any of the instruction manual or knowing what was going on, we had no idea. So it was very confusing from that aspect of not being a game that you could just pick up and play. So, but I do remember seeing those kiosks. Here's a funny story. I just thought of this story. This was at our local Walmart when I was a kid. And I think this may have been, I don't remember if somebody had got abducted or something. I don't remember. But my parents always told me two things. Number one was we had a secret code word. So if anybody had come up to us, and I think, I'm not going to even tell you my real code word. It's top secret. But let's say it was something like Star Wars. So if an adult came up to me, and this is what my parents were always afraid of. They were afraid of us getting tricked. Of an adult coming up and saying, your parents are outside and they're hurt or whatever, and you need to come outside. Then I was supposed to say, what's the code word? So if they said Star Wars, then I was to leave with them. And if they didn't say that, then I was supposed to yell, you know, and get attention, because this was obviously someone who was trying to kill me. So we were at our local Walmart and playing on the kiosk, you know. And the other thing was, we had the code word, right? But the other thing was, if anybody tried to get you to leave the store or do anything like that, you should immediately yell and get the attention of an adult, right? So one time I was at Walmart, and I'm guessing this is like maybe a first or second grade kind of story, so early 80s. Very early 80s. And I was playing on the kiosk, and this other kid came up. I remember he was Indian, like not Native American, but India, the country. And he asked if he could play, and he was about my age, and I said sure. So we were playing Atari, and then you know, a few minutes later, his dad walks up with a shopping cart, and he says, "Oh, you're playing Atari," you know, that sort of thing. And we're like, "Yeah." And so then his dad says, "We have an Atari at home, so maybe sometime you could, if you wanted, you could come to our house and play Atari or whatever." Now, in retrospect, I feel so bad for this man because obviously, putting myself in his shoes, I'm thinking maybe his kid didn't have a lot of friends. Maybe they hadn't been, fully accepted by the community or something, and, or it's just a parent just making a comment and thinking, oh, well, here's a kid that likes Atari. My kid likes Atari, so that we could, maybe we could get them together. So this is what I heard, that he wanted me to leave the store and go to their house and play Atari, which was basically like offering, a kid candy out of a van. And my little internal radar went off, and I thought, this guy's going to kill me, and I started screaming. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, and I remember the look on this guy's face. Like he had just, like, what is this child doing? And then here comes the Walmart employees are running over, and, and then I guess my mom had heard she hadn't been too far from there. So she comes over and, eventually they get straightened out what has happened here. And I feel so bad for this man because, like I said, well, first of all, if his kid didn't have friends before, wait till that story gets around school that his father tried to abduct somebody at Walmart. But, seriously, I do feel bad for that man because I'm sure he had no idea what I was doing or what to do in that situation. So I do feel a little bit bad about that. So one thing that people talk about when they talk about Atari is kind of the end of Atari, right before the crash. And this is when we didn't have the term shovelware back then, but that's when it showed up. And, every third-party manufacturer was making Atari games, and a lot of them sucked. And when when the market began to fall out of video games, those were some of the first ones that were discounted. Retailers. Basically what happened, and like I said, I talked about this on the Video Game Crash. If you're interested in that, go find that episode. But, basically these retailers got stuck. And they weren't able to send these games back to the distributors because the distributors were folding, and the companies that had made some of these games began folding. And so there was nobody to get refunds from. There was nobody to send them back. So retailers got stuck with these games, and they deeply discounted them. I definitely remember seeing these silver box Atari games for like $5 in our local grocery store. And, some of the knockoff ones, $5 or maybe even less. And one I remember is my friend Andy had got a copy of Sneak and Peek. If you've never played it, it is hide and seek on the Atari. And so you're in a house, and one person, hides their eyes, and the other person goes around in the house and hides their little person, and then the other person goes around and goes looking for them. Now, I remember, maybe I was way ahead of my time or whatever, but I remember at that time playing that game and thinking, we could be doing this in real life. And that's something that my dad has he used to say the same thing, like when it came to video games, like fishing video games. Like if you think about a game, Wing Commander, where you're flying a spaceship and you're in space battles and you're doing all this, you're doing something that you can't do in real life. You are doing something fantastic, something that human beings in our lifetime will never do. So, you're living out a fantasy. But like a fishing video game, I think I could be fishing. Like that is something that I am capable of doing. I know how, and I don't like touching fish, but, and be honest with you, I don't really like being outside all that much. But the point remains that I do enjoy being on the beach, and that's something I'm capable of doing. I can, put a worm on a hook, and I can go out and do that. So that's one thing I always thought with Sneak and Peek. I thought, this is something we could be doing in real life. I know how to play hide and seek. This is not something that we need to be playing on the Atari. But that game in particular, I've always associated with, shovelware on the Atari. Like that game just kind of encapsulates that whole era for me of games that were just crappy games that were being, passed on to kids or whatever. So as I mentioned on episode 1 of You Don't Know Flack, we got our TRS-80 in 1980. And it did not have graphics as good as the Atari 2600, I don't think. But it had different kinds of games. It had text adventures, and it had, logic-type games, and things that weren't necessarily, they were different than what the Atari could provide. But in 1982, we got our Franklin Ace 1000. That was our Apple II compatible machine. And I think originally, I don't know that it was mono, but I think our monitor was mono. So originally we didn't have color, but we did get a color AMDEC monitor. I just had a discussion the other day on Twitter about AMDEC monitors, and I have 3 or 4 of them. I love these things. I have the original one that I had it's the one that we had for when we owned an Apple, and then I moved it onto the Commodore, and anyway, getting sidetracked. But there was Pac-Man. There was the Apple version of Pac-Man and different things like that. And those were superior, vastly superior to the version of Pac-Man that was on the Atari 2600. So for me, it wasn't the video game crash that got me away from the Atari 2600. It was the fact that on our Apple, we had a modem. And as long as my dad was buying blank discs, I could call BBS's and I could get games for free. And so we had a joystick on the Apple, and so I started getting games like Montezuma's Revenge and Miner 2049er and things like that on the Apple, and I could get them for free. So that was what kind of pulled me away from the Atari. It wasn't the, like I said, the video game crash or anything like that. It was that I was getting free games on the Apple that were, for the most part, better quality than what was coming out on the Atari at that point. Now, we never got rid of our Atari. In fact, I still have it. We were pretty good at just taking things and boxing them up and putting them in a closet. And that's what happened to our Atari. It got boxed up with all the joysticks and actually with all the manuals and everything. So I still have all the manuals that we had as a kid, which to me is more valuable than the actual games or the console or anything like that. The consoles for a long time, and the games for that matter, were a dime a dozen, and prices have gone back up now. But for a long time, the Ataris were essentially worthless. But the manuals, I do still have all of our old manuals, so I really, I'm glad that we hung on to that stuff. Now, I talked, in some previous episodes, I talked about the gatherings and some of the parties that we used to have with the Brotherhood, the TBH 405, and all those types of groups. And so I had one of those parties one time. I hosted one, and this would have been in 1994, I'm thinking. And I had all these guys over, these different computer people or whatever, and I had brought out our old Atari. And so I had it hooked up and stuff, and people had a blast, And some of those games, Combat, which is, the Pac-In, the original Pac-In game for the Atari 2600. If anybody has other than Pong, it's probably the oldest game, console-based game, or it's probably the oldest cartridge-based game that most people are familiar with. And people picked it up and played it. They thought it was a blast. We were, years later, we were playing, I remember I had Pitfall and River Raid, and I didn't have that many games out, probably about 10 games or so. But people really enjoyed it, And it's funny that we all get this question. If you're into retro stuff, everybody gets this question. When did you start collecting retro things? And I think for a lot of us, it's not that we started collecting retro things, it's just we never got rid of the things, and then we just continued adding with it. The Atari that's sitting on my shelf behind me is the Atari I had, from 1979 or whatever. So it's not like I got into collecting Ataris or whatever. It's just I still have my Atari, and I've added to the collection that we had as a kid. Now, I talked about Ataris being essentially worthless. There was a time, and this was probably in the mid-'90s, I had just started working for the government, and during lunch, there was a couple of thrift stores that were pretty close to where I worked, and we would go over there during lunch, and I specifically, I have an Atari out in the garage right now with a price on it, and I left the price on of $298. I left the price on just to remind me that there was that time where, you couldn't give away Ataris. I mean, people wanted computers, people wanted PlayStations around that time, Super Nintendos. Atari wasn't old enough to be, retro or collectible, and people were giving them away. I talked about this on episode 121 about going to thrift shops, going to garage sales. I couldn't even tell you every time that I went to a garage sale and bought a shoebox full of Atari games, or Atari games for $1 each. It used to happen all the time, and there was that golden era. Again, I'm repeating some things from that episode, but there was that time when the stuff was worthless, and that went up until basically the day eBay launched. And, people just got convinced that everything they had was gold, and so you started dealing with eBay prices, and there's a game store around me called Vintage Stock. There's 3 or 4 locations here. They're mostly in the Southwest. They're in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, this general area. Vintage Stock, when I first started going, had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Atari games for $5 or less. Most of them were $2 or $3, Last time I went there, the dirt common ones, like Pac-Mans that are missing the label, things like that, those are $5. And then what I would still call common, I just happened to see a copy of Empire Strikes Back. It caught my eye. And it was $10.99. Just for a loose cartridge, that's, I don't know, it's too much. And so it's interesting what's happened to the prices over time. I think those prices are going to go back down. I think they are starting to go back down because as collectors get older, the natural, what's the word? Behavior, I guess, of collectors is to collect things. For most people, they collect things that they were interested in when they were a kid. So, either things that they had or things they wish they had. So, as collectors are getting older, I mean, we went through, as Atari prices began going down, Nintendo prices went up. Then Nintendo went down, and I think we're starting to see a raise in price of Genesis and Super Nintendo stuff, and we've seen Nintendo 64 games. So it's just following this natural progression, and I think as collectors tend to get older and they grow out of collecting, we're going to see people dumping Atari collections, and that's just natural for that to happen. But that was a great time from the mid-'90s until the end of the 90s, maybe something like that. Because even when eBay came out, everybody wasn't computer savvy enough to get on and list things. But by the time that everybody could get on there and list things, then it was over. I told a story in that episode where I had gone and bought a Atari, like a thing of like a storage drawers that held Atari games. And, I got this Atari for like $5 or $10, and it came with those drawers that was filled with like 30 games and some fairly rare, I mentioned, Atari games are rated Rarity 1 to Rarity 10, and there's a few different guides. There's a digital press guide, and there's the Atari Age guide. And there were some like R5s and R6s in there that I got for $1 each. They were just literally worthless. People were throwing them away. Everybody thought, well, why would you want to play Atari games, when you have a PlayStation? And there's some validity to that argument. But to the people that, people like me that were collecting them at the time, it was good purchases, I don't really collect Atari games anymore. I was doing it for a while, and like several of my other collections, I didn't set a limit on a number of games, but what I did was I set, price limits, and really what I found was about $5 or $10 was what I was willing to spend for a game. Actually, usually it was about $5, you know. So I ended up with probably like all of the R1, 2, 3, maybe 4 games. Like that. I think last time I checked, I had like, I don't know, I want to say 300 something different Atari games. And it's all kind of moot because I don't ever play them. I have the Atari Anthology on the computer, on the iPad. It's been on several different consoles, so I would play the Atari Anthology and the Activision one on the iPad as well. And then there's emulation. And, I remember the first time that I saw a zip file that contained every known, at that time, Atari 2600 game. And I want to say it was about 3 meg. I think now if you get it with everything, it's about 7 meg, because now we have so many more discovered prototypes and things like that. But at the time it was about 3 meg, and that's a number to me that's fascinating, that you would have, that much history, all those games, everything that would, back then it wouldn't fit on a floppy disk, but it would have fit on a couple. It's just amazing to me that, every Atari game would fit on something that small. I know I've talked about it with the Commodore stuff. I have right here these drawers that I've converted into giant disc boxes, and I have hundreds and hundreds, about 700 right here, Commodore 64 discs. And when you convert them, all of them converted to D64 disc images is like 200 something meg. So you could put them all about 3 times on a CD. I have an SD card. Actually, I have an SD card that I was getting ready to throw away. That's 256 meg because I have no use for it anymore. I had it sitting here for a while, and I don't have anything that I need for it. I was going to give it to one of the kids or something. But that would hold every Commodore disc that I ever downloaded in the 10 years that I was downloading Commodore software. It just baffles me, storage that's available. But anyway, I did pick up one of those Atari flashback consoles. I picked up, I think it was the second generation one. I think I didn't get one of the first ones. I got a second one. And it was okay. We had it hooked up to a monitor for a while, and actually, I just tried to sell it. We had a garage sale last year, and I tried to sell it, and we hooked it up to a TV to try and sell it. And the kids ended up playing it the whole time. They played Pong, they played Yar's Revenge, and a couple other things. So we ended up not selling it. So it's actually sitting right here. If I were to play Atari games today, like I said, I would probably play them through emulation. I do still have, I think I have one model of each of the Ataris. But I had one hooked up until recently, until we moved, but I haven't rehooked one up in this house. It just, as you start to get older and you have to pick and choose what you spend your time on. And, the Atari games, I loved them, but I've played them all, So I'm trying to spend my time now and doing stuff that I haven't done before. And plus there's those other things that you want to do, like when you're a kid, the most important thing is, that brand new Atari game or whatever. But when you get older, I don't know. Spending time on the beach doesn't sound that bad either, you know what I mean? So, anyway, that's about it for the Atari 2600. I'm sure that I could go through game by game and think of different stories or whatever, but like I said, I'm trying to save some of those for Ferg's podcast. I did enjoy the Atari. One other thing I meant to mention is I still have a drawer here. I have several drawers of joysticks and game pads, and I tried to narrow them down to like I looked in the drawer one time and I had like 20 something Nintendo game pads. I'm like, I don't need 20. I need 2 that work, And then I thought, I'll have 2 that work and I'll have 2 spares. Okay, that's fine. Keep 4, but you don't need 30. So I started trying to get rid of those, but I have an entire drawer of old Atari joysticks, and those seem to stick around longer because, they were compatible with the Atari computer line. They were compatible with the Commodore 64, so I had a lot of Atari joysticks around for that reason. So maybe that's why I have more, the normal amount of joysticks, I guess. But I do still have, paddles and all those things. And I also have I always called it my little track and field pad, but I think it has like fake wood grain on it, and we got it from my uncle, and it's laid out for asteroids. And so it has buttons for, rotate left and right, and there's thrust and fire and stuff. So that was a really cool little controller, and I remember playing asteroids with that for a while, and Space Invaders. But then, on the Commodore, I played track and field on it, and but it still works great. So that's kind of a little, I guess, I don't know how rare it is per se, but we hung on to that. So, but that's pretty much it for the Atari 2600. So, guys, I'm gonna work really hard at getting back on schedule here. I've just been so busy with throwback reviews and. I love how I go right to something that I do once every 2 weeks. I've been so busy taking a bath once every 2 weeks. But I have been busy with throwback reviews and work, all the different, little projects I'm working on. So bear with me. We're going to get this ship back on. What do they call it? I was going to say back on the road. You don't get a ship back on the road. That'd be stupid. But anyway, thank you guys for hanging in there with me. I don't know what the next episode of You Don't Know Flack is, but if you have any requests, things you would like to hear on You Don't Know Flack, you can send them to me an email at robohara@robohara.com. You can send them to the You Don't Know Flack voice mailbox. You can call that mailbox anytime, day or night. It goes to a Google Voice number, and it doesn't actually ring at the house. It just sends me an email telling me I have a voicemail, and that number is area code 405-486 You Don't Know Flack. That's YDKF. YDKF, yes, that's right. So, call the voicemail box, leave me a message. If you have feedback, send to me an email, send me the voice message, or however you want to get it to me. Once again, thanks for listening, guys, and this has been episode 138, and I will see you guys, hopefully, next week.